Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome back to Julie's Orchids. Thanks for watching. On today's episode, I thought we would do a brief discussion of the 4 top tips or things to consider for the new orchid hobbyist, particularly someone who has yet to start into the orchid hobby and has not bought their first orchid. We have all heard that growing orchids indoors is impossible, and several other myths. You may have heard that you live in an area up north, like in Canada or somewhere where it gets cold, and you're told, no, you can't grow orchids because you have to grow them indoors. They're not going to get enough light, all sorts of different reasons. And I'm here with my channel to challenge that thought, that you cannot grow orchids indoors, particularly if you are in a harsh climate. Now, I will admit I'm a new orchid grower. I've only been growing for about 2 years, and I've had my YouTube channel here for about a year. And in that time, I have learned a lot of information. And I'm here to share the top 4 things that I have figured out that I wish I knew before I started into my orchid hobby. Now, our first tip today is going to seem pretty self-explanatory, and you're going to think, duh, why are we considering this? But the first thing to consider is your orchid. And you might think, well, that's a plant. What's the big deal with that? Well, there's lots and lots of different kinds of orchids. It's one of the largest plant families in the world. I'm not sure how many million different kinds of orchids there are, but you can find them just about in every continent on the globe, with the exception of the North and South Poles. And I'm wondering if sometime in our way distant past that there might have been orchids growing there. But the whole point of getting to know your orchid is to research it. What kind of genre of orchid do you want? Are you wanting a Phalaenopsis, otherwise known as the moth orchid? And those are very readily available and easy to purchase. Or maybe you would like something a bit more spectacular, like a slipper orchid, either a Phragmipedium or a Paphiopedilum. That's wonderful. All of those kind of orchids are good orchids for newbies to start out with. But the problem is that even with Phalaenopsis and your slipper orchids, that there's a wide range of geographies throughout the world that you can find them in. So they have different growing conditions and climates. And our job as orchid enthusiasts and growers is to figure out how to provide the plants with what they need. And to do that, you need to understand your plant and where it comes from and what conditions it receives in nature. And so let's say you've settled on an orchid, and you can go to the internet, do your research, and find out where that orchid is from in the world. And that'll tell you a lot about its requirements to grow it to be happy and healthy and flower for you. Leading into that, knowing your orchid follows up with our top tip number 2, and that's knowing your growing conditions. Now, I'm talking specifically about growing plants indoors, but this will work with people that can grow plants outdoors or a mixture of both, depending on the seasons. But the top tip number 2 is to know your growing conditions. And I'm going to have that to be encompassed, even if you're an indoor grower, your outdoor environment, because your outdoor environment, even if you run ducted aircon and heating through your house, does have certain effects on your indoor climate, if you will. Some orchids need much higher humidity levels. Others need much higher light. Some need longer photo periods of light exposure, and some need less time. Some need more constant high temperatures, and some can handle cooler temperatures. So again, knowing your orchid from tip 1 will help you understand your environment and how you can make changes to that environment to help your orchid grow. So we've quickly ran down the first 2 top 4 things to know before you start into the orchid hobby or for the orchid newbie. And if you're finding this information helpful, I'd appreciate a like. A subscribe would be great. And be sure to stick around to the end of the video, because we will be discussing what I consider the number 1 thing to know before starting your orchid journey. Carrying on to step 3. And again, step 3 is going to seem a bit obvious, like step number 1, but step number 3 is knowing yourself as a grower. Now, if you are an active grower and you like to have houseplants in the house and you think I'd like to expand my collection to include some flowering things like orchids, that's great. But what you need to understand is that houseplants and orchids require different care. And a lot of times growers that are used to growing houseplants, when they get orchids, have a lot of bad troubles and struggles with their orchids because they're treating them in the same fashion which they treat houseplants. Now, orchid growing is easy once you figure it out, but you also really have to figure yourself out. And unlike houseplants, where you can just give a little squeeze of water here and there, a little bit of light, and they're generally fine, orchids require a tiny bit more doting. So to understand yourself is, do you have the patience? Are you adaptable and flexible in what's going on with your plants and your environment? What you're doing when you first start off may not actually be working well for the orchid, and you may need to make subtle changes through the year or years that you're growing the orchid to figure out and fine-tune your growing methods. And you also have to understand yourself. So for a lot of people, they don't have the time to invest in that for a large orchid collection, but 1 or 2 orchids around the house might be sufficient. So that's important to know yourself as well. Are you one of these people that tends to overwater orchids? If you're one of those people that really tends to water your houseplants quite a bit, you'll likely overwater your orchids right off the bat, and that'll cause a lot of problems for many genres of orchids. So knowing yourself and knowing your habits and routines will help you with your orchid journey. As an example, I think a possible good orchid for a fairly new orchid grower or someone that's been growing houseplants for a while would be a slipper orchid, a dancing lady orchid. The Oncidiums might be a little bit too finicky, even though they also like a lot of water. But the slipper orchids like to maintain a dampness in their pot more similar to, say, a houseplant. So those would be a very good plant for someone new to the orchid hobby that's been growing house plants for a long time successfully and tends to water quite a bit. So try researching your orchids and figuring out their water requirements. And if you know you're a heavy waterer, step 1, know your orchid. Step 2, your environment. And step 3. So step 1, you know your orchid. It's thirsty, it likes to be wet. Know yourself. Step 3, you know you're a heavy waterer. So those 2 orchids might go together. Step 2, knowing your environment. Can you grow this orchid in your house? What are the light levels for it? Can you provide that in your environment? All these little things will help you figure out, are you ready to pop into caring for orchids? Are you adaptable and willing to learn from your orchid and with your orchid as you guys grow and bloom together? Okay, thanks for sticking around through the video this far. We've made it through the top 3 tips to know for a new orchid grower, and here we are for the top. What I think is the most important tip, and that is to set realistic expectations. Now this can go for more than just growing orchids indoors or growing orchid outdoors. It can go for any new hobby that you're picking up, is to set realistic expectations. Nobody can expect to grow an award-winning specimen-side orchid when you have never grown orchids before or have only been growing orchids for 3-4 months, or even, say, like me, a couple of years. I have the reality that orchids are slow growers. It's going to take time. I'm going to make mistakes and continue to make mistakes and learn and adapt with my orchids to find out what's best for them, to give them their best growing environments. So for me, realistically, I realize I'm not going to take an orchid into an orchid show and walk out with a #1 placement in the show because I'm a new grower. Also, if you live in a climate that's very hot and dry, like mine here in Western Australia, it's not realistic to think that you're going to grow something that requires a cool or cold environment unless you are willing to invest the money to really control your environment inside your home to match those of the cold environment that the orchid comes from. Now, an example of this is a Dracula orchid or the Masdevallias. I love the Dracula orchids and I think they're beautiful orchids, but there's no way in the world I would ever attempt to grow that orchid in my environment because I know it would not be successful. It just gets way too hot here. Even with the aircon and the heating, it's too expensive to keep the inside of the house cold enough for a Dracula orchid when the outside of the house is 42, 43, or 44 degrees Celsius. That's just not cost effective. As another example, if you work a lot of hours or strange hours or have to travel, perhaps you don't need an orchid that requires to be wet or watered as frequently. Maybe you need something that can handle a longer wet, dry cycle, like a Phalaenopsis orchid. And again, this all goes back into points 1, 2, and 3. Knowing your orchid, knowing your growing environment, and knowing yourself. And if you set realistic expectations within those 3 parameters and have a symbiotic relationship with your plants, and you monitor them, dote on them a little bit throughout the year, throughout all of your seasonal changes, and see how they react and respond, you will learn together. Your orchid will learn your environment and acclimatize to it, and you'll slowly start getting your blooms that we all grow orchids for. Now, I have one last secret tip for all of you guys out there that are new to the orchid growing hobby or are wanting to get into the orchid hobby. And I'm going to renege on the last tip, knowing and setting realistic expectations being the number one thing. I'm going to say my bonus tip here is the number one thing. And most important is to have fun. Orchid growing is fun. It's educational. You learn a lot about yourself and the plants and your environment along the process of growing these orchids. And then you get rewarded with beautiful flowers. And sometimes those beautiful flowers have lovely fragrances. My top 4 tips for the new orchid hobbyist or someone considering buying their first orchid: get to know your orchid, know your environment, know yourself, set realistic expectations, and by all means, have fun with the process. So if you found this information helpful, please hit the like button. That does help the algorithm get this out to a wider audience. Do subscribe because I'll be planning on further newbie growing tips and tricks based off of what I've learned in the last couple of years of growing orchids indoors in my environment in Perth, Western Australia. Thank you again for watching, and you guys have a wonderful day.